Thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Eva Brennis-Kempers, and I'm a junior research associate at the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. For those of you who are attending the Talking Animals series for the first time, just a quick note on the format. First, we'll start with around 45 minutes of presentation, and then after that, we'll have another 40 minutes or so for a Q&A and discussion. The event will end at around 6:30 p.m. UK time. You are all warmly invited to participate in the discussion. In case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the Q&A function. I will then go through the questions in the discussion section. You can also upvote those questions that you would like to be asked. We will be recording the presentation part of this event and will later be also uploading the video to our website. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Danielle Celermajer. Danielle is a political theorist with a focus on justice. She is professor of Sociology and Criminology, deputy director of the Sydney Environment Institute, and lead of the Multispecies Justice project. Her books include Sins of the Nation and the Ritual of Apology and the Prevention of Torture, an ecological approach, both with Cambridge University Press. With Alex Lefebvre, the subject of human rights at Stanford University Press, among many others. In her work on multi-species justice, she is now involved in a number of international collaborations, such as Animals in the Room and the More Than Human Life project. Her latest book, co-authored with other members of the Multispecies Justice Collective, is Institutionalizing Multispecies Justice with Cambridge University Press, 2025. Thank you for being here today, Danny.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you everybody for coming. I wish I could see you. It's quite strange to be speaking to an audience who I can't see, but I really appreciate you being here and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. I'm actually in New York at the moment. I've been here for the More Than Human Life Festival and conference, but normally I live on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Yuin Nation in a rainforest in Southeast Australia. So my work is very informed by where I live, and I am far away from home at the moment. So the paper that I'm speaking to today is about responsibility. And as I'll explain in a moment, it's a multi-layered paper. But I am particularly interested in this paper with questions about how we as scholars of law and philosophy, social and political theory, ought to conceptualize legal and moral responsibility in the context of today's ecological catastrophes and the mass violence against Earth others, including, of course, animals and the ecological worlds that support their lives. My fundamental argument is that conceptualizing responsibility in this context of ecological collapse and unraveling really requires us to have a radically expansive conception of responsibility, both with respect to who is responsible and also to whom responsibility is owed. So this is very much a paper about the ecological context in which conceptualizing, the work of conceptualization does. The paper makes three linked arguments about responsibility, one in favour of these expansive conceptions, both of who is responsible and to whom responsibility is owed, one regarding the contextual nature of conceptualisation, and particularly what it means to conceptualise when dominant forms of human life are bringing about mass ecological unravelling, and one regarding scholars and legal practitioners' responsibilities with respect to imagining and conceptualizing responsibility. One of the key claims I want to make is about the relationship between theorizing and embodied encounter. So I think this is always the case, but particularly when we're talking about responsibility or conceptualizing towards Earth others, towards other animals, and in this context of mass violence, law and philosophy as disciplines and practices can only come to stand in an ethical relationship with Earth others, in my view, when the humans who practice these disciplines are willing to enter into material embodied relationships with those about whom we're theorizing in the midst of their plights, relationships where we can be affected. And so I'm going to commence this talk by reading from a book that Eva didn't mention, a book called Summertime that I wrote both during and in the wake of the Black Summer fires, which killed, we know it killed over 3 billion animals. And one of the animals who was killed was Katie, and she was a pig with whom I lived before the fires. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a context for the excerpt that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to jump into it. So Summertime opens with the repercussions of what happened on December 31st, 2019. So 2 days before that, so on December 29th, we had evacuated 2 of the pigs, Jimmy and Katie, to a farm outside a place called Cabargo, when our shared home, the home that I shared with Katie and Jimmy and many other animals, was directly threatened by the fire. Early in the morning of the 31st, we had cleared out our house the night before because we were all evacuating. I received a call from the person who had taken Jimmy and Katie, telling me that the entire land there had been immolated, killing everybody who had been there. The next day, I got a text with a very granular photo of Jimmy running towards the phone, with this person's voice saying, "It's okay, it's okay." And it turned out that he had survived the fire. And a week later, we went down, the roads opened, and we went down and we brought him home. And I actually wrote what became the opening chapter of Summertime a few days later, when I was witnessing his devastating, life-threatening grief as he was trying to come to terms with the violent death of Katie, his sister, and also the apocalypse that he had survived himself. So this chapter happens 80 pages into the book. I told you that Katie died, but that initial telling was about the impact of her death on others. On me, standing in our half-emptied house when I heard Em's voice over the phone. On Elle, perched on the back of a truck, unloading the contents of our house when he heard my voice over the phone. And on Jimmy, who didn't have to hear about it because he was there with Katie until the moment he walked into a life without her. I also didn't tell you a lot about how she died or what death might have been like for her. That was in part because for a long time, Jimmy's loss took up all my mental and emotional space. And if I'm honest, it was in part because the 0 point of death, especially a death that involved immeasurable suffering, is difficult to approach. Now it's time to talk about Katie, or more precisely, Katie's death. When we arrived to collect Jimmy and take him home from the fire zone, there were no people around. So we continued up the driveway to the spot where it was evident that the house and the garage had once stood. Torn and tangled corrugated iron, the remains of brick walls, a burnt-out barrel or 2, blackened, brittle remains of the shrubs. Katie's body lying on grass become charcoal behind a screen of blackened twigs that I guess were the remains of what must have been the garden around the house. I saw her from some distance because before I had a chance to decide whether I wanted to see her. And then I thought about whether to look away or to take in the sight of her. I know how certain images can haunt you. Once seen, they cannot be unseen, like passages in books describing unbearable cruelties. And as soon as I'd read them, I wished I'd not. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that as soon as I'd read them, I knew they were going to be with me for good and that this was going to have consequences. It's an ethical dilemma whether to know or shield oneself from knowing. There was no mistaking this was Katie. The shape of her back is so distinctive. only now it is charred black, with one or two patches of her once pink flesh visible through the honeycomb of burnt skin. Her back legs were sticking up in the air, and although it too was burnt, I could see the petty toe at the end of her top leg, still dainty. My daughter used to joke that it looked like Katie was walking on high heels because her petty toe feet always looked ill-proportioned against her rotund body. I couldn't see her head or her face because it was rounded away from me. From here, it looks almost like she stops at her neck. I decide to go a little closer. She is, after all, Katie, and I owe it to her to see what she has become in the fire. She had no choice but to go through it. I can bear witness to what remains. When I get closer, I see that what was her entrails had spilled out onto the ground. It's been 8 days and a few hours since she was killed, 8 days in January in Southeast Australia, and she's lain split open through the unrelenting dry heat. The absence of a putrid stench struck me as odd. By now her body was parched. Perhaps the time of stench had passed. I was relieved at not being consumed by the nausea, but it was also disconcerting, as if the perceptions coming in through my different senses didn't match up. I want to be able to tell you about her face, but I cannot. Either I didn't look closely or I did, but I can't remember what I saw. Most likely I stopped just short there at her face, because looking into that face had been such an intimate privilege, from her always tentative grey eyes down to her magnificent shiny at the front nose, up the stretch of forehead, and then to her huge ears, the points bent down at the top. That she would look at me when I was looking at her was an achievement we had worked for together. Now it could only be me looking at her, which seems to me the literal experience and not merely the concept of another's death. I touch the aloneness of the moment, or rather it touches me. That she died thus sticks in my throat as though I have swallowed pieces of gravel. You have to drag yourself through the sludge of thick resistance to make vivid for yourself the truth that someone you love died a violent and agonizing death. Part of what it means to love someone is precisely to be committed to protecting them from violence and suffering. In this finality of violent death, you have to face your failure. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about some deluded fantasy of omnipotence. I'd long given that up. This is a more sober acknowledgement of our inevitable finitude. In Katie's case, that finitude carries a particular irony, because we humans have our fingerprints all over the violence that pervaded her life and the attempt to curb it. At one end of that life, animal activists had scooped her and Jimmy up, tiny and starving, from the factory farm floor where they had been left to die, presumably not considered worth the cost of food. It was those people witnessing and refusing the slow violence from which Jimmy and Katie were dying that carried those babies into their and our future lives. In the beginning, human violence took the form of disposability. In the end, human violence took on the form that escaped human control, the fast violence of our fires. In the end, depending on where you stood, Katie went back to be counted amongst livestock that was lost in the fire, or she remained Katie, uncountable. So that's the end of that excerpt. And I'm aware of the heaviness of those words. They weigh very heavy on me, even reading them several years later, that continue to resonate with the reverberations of her meeting the fire and me meeting her body. But I wanted to start here because it seems to me that absent an encounter with the truths of violence and harm, our theorizing about responsibility remains abstracted from reality and so is ultimately irresponsible. The paper that I'm speaking to is quite a long one, and it has a few distinct arguments, which I can't comprehensively go through today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to lay out the different parts of the argument and signal which ones I'm going to go into, and then I'm happy to take questions on ones that I don't. So the paper starts with a discussion of a legal case called Sharma, which was a recent legal climate justice case in Australia where 8 young people claimed that when she was making decisions concerning approval of fossil fuel projects, the Minister for the Environment has a duty of care to take into consideration the climate-driven impacts of those projects on young people now and in the future. And there were 2 judgments in that case, the original one, which found in favour of the children, and the judgment on appeal. And they manifest 2 very different theories of responsibility, one which is expansive and very sensitive to the complex causal chains that are involved in climate change, and the other one which is quite narrow and based on much more classical liberal understandings of agency, causation and responsibility. And they also display 2 very different understandings of the judge's responsibility to make judgment and to conceptualize something like duty of care in the face of climate catastrophe. The second section then steps away from the contemporary context, and I consider 3 theorists who theorized during and after the Shoah or the Holocaust: Hannah Arendt, Karl Jaspers, and Emmanuel Levinas. And they're interesting for me because they're very clear that it was their confrontation with reality that provoked these conceptions of what I call unconditioned responsibility, which radically broke with their inherited link between individual agency and responsibility. I'm not going to say anything about that section, but I'll say a few words about Arendt. But I think what that work does is it demonstrates the critical role that context and at-stakeness of context plays in the way in which we can do our theoretical work. Section 3 then moves back to the contemporary context and asks who's responsible for addressing the impacts of climate change, and what sort of concepts or conceptualization of responsibility is adequate to grasp in ethical ways the structural multidimensional chains of causation and harms. And the work in this section is to try and think through a range of theoretical traditions that provide us with resources to think about harms with such reach and such complex patterns across different systems, as well as discursive systems that normalize violence. And then section 4 moves from who is responsible to whom is responsibility owed in the face of climate change. And here I draw on a range of factors to argue that legal and moral responsibility has to be understood as owed to all Earth beings in relationship, and to animals in particular. And then section 5, which again, I'm not going to speak about, looks at how, if we've got this very expansive conception of responsibility that goes well beyond the direct perpetrators, how do we allocate responsibility that takes into consideration very different types of power relationships and relationships with the harm. That section, I tried to summarize it for the purposes of this paper, but it's quite complex, and I wanted to do it justice, so I'm happy to speak about it if people want to, but I'm skipping over it. And then the concluding section turns the lens back on us to argue that philosophers and legal and social and political theorists have an obligation to imagine and robustly champion conceptions of responsibility consonant with the burning of our time. So I'm going to move into the section on the Sharma case now. So the legal context for this case was whether so there's a duty of care obligation on the Minister for the Environment set out in the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's a Commonwealth Federal Act in Australia. The question being raised was, does that duty of care include children who will be affected by the impacts of climate change driven by greenhouse gas emissions that follow from the projects that the minister is being asked to approve? in arguing that this duty of care exists with respect to the particular approval that was the subject of the case, Anjali Sharma and the other plaintiffs, so she was the lead young person in the case, argued that a reasonable person in the minister's position could foresee that a risk of injury to the children, and I'm quoting from the case, would flow from the contribution to increased atmospheric CO2 and consequent increased global average surface temperatures brought about by the combustion of the coal, which the minister's approval would facilitate. The minister mounted a number of arguments against this claim based on what she framed as weak and diffuse connections between her decision and the future harms that the children may suffer. And she argued, and again, I'm quoting from the case, that the foreseeability of harm from her conduct was causally negated by the complex interaction of factors that will evolve over coming decades. Further, each step in the causal chain of events relied upon by the applicants to connect her conduct to the harm alleged was a contingency, and the possibility of that contingency not occurring denied the foreseeability of harm. Now, when he was reflecting on these legal and philosophical questions, that these two very different conceptions, one that recognized the complex chains and the other one that said that there needed to be a much more proximate relationship and much more predictability, Justice Bromberg, the presiding judge, quoted from Lord Atkin in Donoghue and Stevenson v. Stevenson. It's a 1932 case. And I think it's a really powerful quote, so I wanted to share it. The rule that you are to love your neighbour becomes in law, you must not injure your neighbour. And the lawyer's question is, who is my neighbour? This receives a restricted reply. You must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. Who then, in law, is my neighbour? That's the end of the quote. So the minister's answer to this question, as reflected in the arguments, was that the neighbourhood relationship that grounds the interpretation of responsibility in this body of law was lacking in this case. In other words, the stunted future lives that were very, very graphically illustrated in a huge amount of empirical evidence that was brought before the judge. Those stunted lives were neither her neighbours nor the neighbours of those proposing the mine in this interpretation of law. But Justice Bromberg was completely unsympathetic to the argument that complex chains of causation and temporal or spatial distance between the decision and the future impacts obviated her responsibility. He also considered salient what he called the special vulnerability of the children or their innocence. And he wasn't romanticizing children by talking about their innocence, but he was referring to what we know is the basis of climate justice arguments, which is this inverse relationship between contribution and impacts of climate change. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about animals. Now, in the judgment on appeal, when they overturned the decision, the three justices argued that the minister had insufficient control over the projected harm, that sufficient closeness and directness between the minister and the children was lacking, and that the class to which the duty would be owed, in other words, children and future generations, was not sufficiently determinate. For them, the requirements of responsibility or duty of care included temporal and spatial proximity, causal certainty, and a bound and determinate agent and a bound and determinate harmed object or harmed subject. But what was really interesting in this judgment on appeal was that one of the justices, Justice Beach, expressed his unease with the concepts to which he saw himself bound. And I'm going to quote from his judgment. Concepts like sufficient closeness and directness and indeterminacy, he argued, in their present form may have reached their shelf life, particularly when one is dealing with acts or omissions that have wide-scale consequences that transcend confined temporal boundaries and geographic ranges, and where more than direct mechanistic causal pathways are involved. In other words, he was very explicit about the insufficiency of the concepts that he felt bound to. And yet he still insisted that it was not within the authority of the court. And so it wasn't part of his responsibility to modify concepts that, as he put it, or it wasn't his responsibility to engineer new seed varieties for sustainable duties of care. So Bromberg, the justice in the original case, his assumption of authority, and this is Beecher's words, in taking the bold step of planting new seeds was, in his view, an overreach. Now, one can argue that this interpretive divergence was just a matter of different legal philosophies, but I think this misses a really critical point, which was that the relationship between the justices, the judgment, and the context in which they were philosophizing or judging or conceptualizing. Now, the appeal justices were relatively silent on this, and this is in part because the primary evidence wasn't brought to the appeal justices. As we know, on appeal, they're looking at the case. They don't have the evidence of young people and experts actually physically being brought in front of them. But Justice Bromberg was very, very explicit about the impact of this evidence on him. And I'm just going to quote a couple of the really salient pieces from his judgment. Australia will be lost and the world as we know it gone. The physical environment will be harsher, more extreme, and devastatingly brutal when angry. As for human experience, the quality of life, opportunities to partake in nature's treasures, the capacity to grow and prosper, all will be greatly diminished. Today's adults have gained previously unimaginable power to harm tomorrow's children. We are, he said, being asked to make decisions concerning, quote, the greatest intergenerational injustice ever inflicted by one generation of humans upon the next. And I'm aware he's only speaking about humans, but I'm going to use the structure of his judgment. So I think this raises some really interesting and critical meta questions. What's the relationship between legal interpretation and the material world in which this intellectual work takes place? Does responsibility demand a cautious respect for legal and intellectual precedent? Or does the context where we are of Earth systems collapse and what I've called omnicide, the killing of everything, mandate that people who occupy key institutional roles and hence have the power to bring about conceptual change and legal change, does that mandate a type of responsibility which includes the willingness to break with institutional norms and conceptual frameworks constituted for a different world? And this, I think, is a question that we scholars face and need to be really placed face to face with today. So in Sharma, in this case, these questions about the meta questions about responsibility face the judges, but as scholars who are theorizing, in this case, I'm talking about responsibility, but it could be democracy or freedom or agency or subjecthood. We face similar moral quandaries about how do we navigate the commands of precedent, caution, and on the other hand, this unfolding and ever more rapidly unfolding reality. What's our responsibility as we conceptualize responsibility? Should concepts shift as conditions in the world shift, including ecological conditions? And more pointedly, are the conceptualizations of the Holocene appropriate to this age, whatever we're going to call it, the capitalocene, the Eremocene, the Anthropocene, the age of collapse? Now, we're not without our models in answering these questions, and there's a famous and really amazing interview that Hannah Arendt did for German television in 1961, when she described her own eruption or the eruption of her own sense of responsibility. And she says it was the moment when she witnessed the burning of the Reichstag in 1933 and people being taken to Gestapo cellars or to concentration camps. At this moment, she said, she could no longer philosophize according to what she called the rule of intellectuals, Gleichschaltung, coordination, where, and these are her words, one fabricates ideas about everything. We are trapped by our own ideas. So what is it for us now who are witnessing not the burning of the Reichstag, but the burning of our planet and the mass murder of billions of other living beings? What does it mean to conceptualize in the age of omnicide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about where do we get resources for more expansive conceptions of who is responsible. So responsibility, as Robin Eckersley wrote, is one of those especially overburdened words. And Eva mentioned to me just before this call that she's in a library with 20,000 books, was it, I think, about animal law? Well, there must be 20 million books about responsibility, and it's been conceptualized in all sorts of ways. It's a particularly overburdened and contested concept in the context of climate change, where many people have pointed to the inadequacy of conceptions that understand responsibility in these individualized, direct, linear, and proximate terms. But that rejection of what I'm calling liberal conceptions of responsibility forms part of a much larger body of theory that insists that when we're talking about structural injustices and structural violence, which of course includes industrial animal agriculture and mass extinction driven by habitat destruction, in that context, we demand much more capacious and complex conceptions of responsibility. And the good news is that people have done a lot of work on that. I'm just going to point to two bodies of work that I find particularly fruitful. The first one is Iris Marion Young's social connection model, where she specifically developed these ideas about responsibility to deal with what she called the incapacity of the liability model to explain the etiology of structural injustices, where the outcome, the injustice or the harm, is not the outcome of singular and specific acts or omissions, but the cumulative result of formally uncoordinated and widely distributed actions, which are themselves, for the most part, considered normal. So we've got many uncoordinated actions which have been normalized across a range of institutions in discursive and cultural systems that come together to produce these mass forms of violence and injustice. So not only, of course, that doesn't only apply to climate change, but, you know, you can think about all of the uncoordinated actions that go towards producing mass violence against animals in various contexts. And I think she offers a particularly generative approach. So I want to just say two things that I see of particular note about her approach. The first, she links responsibility with various mostly indirect actors who enable, incentivize, normalize, legitimate, and create the conditions for injustice and wrongdoing. And that means that she casts a far wider net of responsibility than we normally would do if we have these liberal conceptions or we're thinking about blame. And so she draws our attention to this much more kind of variegated map of responsibility, which is born from power, privilege, and capacity, not only to cause harm, but to create the discursive and institutional environments which enable harm, and even worse, which completely invisibilize harm. And we know, of course, this is, you know, one of the main issues that animal rights and animal justice scholars, particularly in philosophy, but also in social and cultural theory, try to bring to the fore these discursive systems which invisibilize all of the systems of harm. The second aspect of her understanding of responsibility that is particularly important to me in my work is that she is interested in prospective responsibility rather than retrospective responsibility. In other words, responsibility to take actions to mitigate the harm and injustice and violence rather than responsibility for having done it. Now, Of course, there's a relationship between retrospective responsibility and prospective responsibility, but she wants to argue, and I agree with her, that prospective responsibility isn't just simply a translation of retrospective responsibility. Rather, as she understands it, prospective responsibility rests on the different dimensions of capacity to bring about change. So most obviously, capacity to bring about change is different dimensions of power and privilege. And in that regard, those with the power to cause the change, to cause the harm, might think about fossil fuel companies or governments that have enabled them. They also have the power to mitigate the harm, or those who have the privilege by being interpolated into the system can withdraw their support. But she argues capacity is also found amongst those who have an interest in change and those who have the capacity to organise. And often those are going to be people who have actually had very little role in causing the harm. So there's a way in which prospective and retrospective responsibility come apart. And the reason that she did that was she was trying to think about how do we best create the conditions for mitigating harm rather than just thinking about retrospective responsibility, which I think is a very important thing for us to hang on to, but it causes some conceptual tensions. The second body of work that I see as really important and extremely helpful in thinking this through are Indigenous philosophies around responsibility. And of course, these are far from new, but have been systematically delegitimated in the Western Academy, including, as Zoe Todd argued, in the various ontological terms that claim to have discovered new expansive ontologies or forms of responsibility. Now, I go into this in a lot greater length in the paper, but in drawing on Indigenous philosophies as a non-Indigenous person, I want to acknowledge my debt to them and everything that I've learned and continue to learn, but at the same time, just be very careful about appropriating or cherry picking or taking philosophies out of context. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot to say here and a lot to learn from. So as Kathy Lynn writes, responsibility forms part of a larger complex of values, including respect, reciprocity, relationship, and reverence. Similarly, Kyle Powers-White describes how particular responsibilities belong within a more comprehensive web of interspecies responsibilities that are tied to a community's cosmology, explaining that cosmology refers to the fundamental ways in which community members in common experience everything around them as endowed or not with agency, spirituality, and connectedness. Now, importantly, these Indigenous theorists are embedded in political arrangements that embody and keep in existence these much more capacious forms of responsibility. And this is very much speaks to my principal argument. They have long insisted that foundational concepts, including responsibility, can't be detached from the worlds that they both enable and disable. So I want to turn now to the question of to whom is responsibility owed? And we'll start with a very brief quote from the amazing ecofeminist Val Plumwood, who wrote, "With nature, as with the human sphere, the capacity to take responsibility for others is an index of our moral being." Now, the evidence in Sharma included extensive details of the severe harms that climate change will inflict on future humans, on their prosperity, their physical and mental health, and their capacity to live safely and well or to survive at all. But of course, humans are not the only ones who will be gravely impacted or even those who will be worse impacted, nor are those who have already been impacted. And this is something that I don't think that we can say often enough, that climate change has already impacted millions of human beings and billions of animals. So again, to go back to the Black Summer fires, which I know so intimately, the unprecedented range and intensity of the fires not only killed 3 billion animals, but I think we need to understand they completely undermined animals' capacity, adaptive capacities to navigate ecological disasters. So Australia is a country where bushfires or wildfires, as they're known in the US, are, part of the ecological system. But no matter what animals did, there were no trees that were high enough. There was no possibility of flying far enough away. They were, for the most part, unable to escape the exposure, the smoke inhalation, the exhaustion, the loss of oxygen, or just being hit by the fire front. And in the aftermath, the habitats and that were their food sources and their sources of shelter were, of course, destroyed. And then we had these compounding, unraveling as ecological systems where we have beneficial relationships, reciprocal relationships. Think about rainforest birds and rainforests, where those systems start to unravel. And so you get decimation of both animal populations and those ecological systems. And this is something that I wrote about in Summertime, but I think it's really important to say every time I use that figure 3 billion, it can be a very reductive number. We kind of just pass over it as if there's 3 billion somethings, as opposed to 3 billion Katies who had lives and relationships and worlds that came apart. And I don't think we should ever abstract our work from engaging with that reality as much as we can. So that responsibility is owed to mitigate the suffering of beings other than humans in the face of anthropogenic climate change seems intuitively obvious. And of course, I'm sure it does to everybody here. And, of course, it's true that hegemonic systems of Western moral philosophy have reserved moral considerability for some humans, not all humans. And, I'm sure in all of your work and the scholarship and activism that you're exposed to, everybody here is well rehearsed in the various arguments that the bases of human exceptionalism that form the foundation of those hegemonic Western philosophical conceptions and institutional structures have been one by one taken apart, either through understanding who animals actually are and the way that they function, or just looking at the way in which the idea of the exceptional human was constituted on the basis of the exclusion of other forms of life. So I'm not going to go over that, except to say, as entanglement and interdependence and knowledge about others becomes more and more recognized in Western thought, and Indigenous thought gets, some recognition. And as the crises intensify, these arguments only get stronger and more compelling. And even, where there is ongoing resistance, which of course there is, for the most part, there's some recognition that even if animals aren't subjects of justice, they're moral patients, that something is owed to them. But if you look at the actual structure and operation of law and policy, the responsibility that ought to flow from these analyses, in fact, approaches pretty much zero. This is true in biodiversity laws, which consistently discount animals' fundamental interests, even in the face of relatively trivial human interests. And it's true in disaster law response and recovery, where I just was looking at some new guidelines in Australia around disaster response with respect to animals. And the first principle that's set out for orienting disaster response with animals is the protection of human life. So when you're considering going into the fireground, are humans kept safe? And then when we actually look at the reality of disasters, the state, almost the entire attention and resources of the state are directed towards human life and human property. One particular graphic example that I think brings these biodiversity and disaster contexts together is, after the Black Summer fires, an estimated 64,000 koalas were killed and huge portions of their habitat were destroyed. But the legislative regime that putatively protects them waved through developments that destroyed some of the largest colony habitats of koalas in New South Wales. So whatever conceptualization of responsibility for the more than human or for animals is at work is completely failing to undergird even minimal duties of care, let alone climate justice. And to go back to Bromberg's words, if we think about climate justice in terms of the imbalance between contribution and impact, how much did a population or an individual contribute to the causes of climate change and what are the impacts? Other animals are very clearly the most innocent, absolutely zero contribution, but on the absolute front line of the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. So, I think there are many pretty clear and growing arguments that responsibility is owed to them. But even the illusion of separation, which undergirded the earlier exclusions, even that is starting to fall away. So if the systematic externalization of the costs of certain forms of life, combined with what I think of as the generosity of the Holocene, afforded some humans the illusion that their irresponsibility towards the more than human would have no costs on us, that illusion is shattering today. And not only amongst those of us who theorize entanglement, evidence of the dire human health impacts of the failure of functioning of ecosystems is growing all around us if we think about what we know about what's happening through habitat destruction, ecosystem destruction, on the impacts of climate, of pandemics, for example. Okay. So I'm now in the final few paragraphs where I want to turn back to us, and I start with a quote from Arendt. This was an immediate shock for me, and from that moment, I felt responsible. So philosophers and legal and political theorists, like judges, operate within institutional structures and cultures that shape what knowledge is and which conceptual moves are considered legitimate. And moreover, as feminist and critical race and Indigenous scholars have insisted, those institutional structures and cultures and the habits of what counts as legitimate are themselves formed within these larger political economies and have been complicit in the role that universities and intellectuals have played in providing the intellectual infrastructure to legitimate gendered, colonial, and race, social, economic, and political orders. But it's not only intra-human dynamics that constitute the field of politics and knowledge. What I want to say is that the historical instantiation of the Earth and Earth systems have also provided the unacknowledged background or the conditions under which the production of knowledge and the criteria for philosophical arguments occur. So conceptualizations, in other words, have an ecological foundation, and reconceiving requires attending to those ecological conditions. So if we think about the Holocene, that 10,000-year period of stable climatic conditions didn't just afford these generous contexts for material abundance for humans, albeit highly unevenly distributed, or more malignly, the conditions under which some humans could sustain the illusion that Earth others could be treated as a fungible and infinite resource in the service of our ever-increasing improvement. This context of the Holocene also enabled the concealment of the finitude of what capitalism and colonialism treated as infinite, and the perpetuation of knowledge systems that cast Earth others and certain other human beings as belonging to this ontological category of those whose exploitation had neither moral valence nor consequence for the official beneficiaries. So that kind of context of the Holocene enabled that type of externalization. And it was in that context that the dominant conceptualizations that we've inherited formed. Clinging to those hegemonic conceptions of responsibility, I think, represents a multiple failure. it's a failure or perhaps a refusal to recognise that the conditions under which the theorising occurs have radically changed. It's a failure to theorise in favour of the Earth and the vast majority of Earth beings. And it's a failure to acknowledge the dangerous conceptual illusions, principally about individualism and Enlightenment humanism, that remain bound to dominant conceptions of responsibility. And it's a failure to ethically exercise the privilege that the community of scholars enjoys with respect to knowledge, including epistemic access and alternative conceptual possibilities, imagination. So as theorists, we may not have particular power over institutions that shape environmental and animal futures, or at least no more power than other privileged others. But we do have particular capacities, going back to Young's argument about the link between prospective responsibility and capacity. We do have particular capacities that carry responsibilities, and I'm just going to name a few of them. First, with regards to our capacity to conceptualise in ways that address real harms before us. And like I said, you know, in recent years, feminist scholars, Indigenous scholars, disability scholars, race scholars, queer scholars, and so on, have really forced this recognition of the broader discursive economy within which conceptualisation happens. And I think it's now critical to rethink our foundational ethical concepts in light of the ecological context that we're in. And I would say, I've talked about responsibility, but I think the same goes for thinking about other foundational concepts like agency, freedom, democracy, and so on. The second, of course, concerns our role as teachers, and despite challenges to human exceptionalism, you know, many of you may teach animal law or animal ethics, but for the most part, mainstream humanities and social science courses are overwhelmingly anthropocentric. So what would happen if we were to refract all of the issues that people work on through the reality of climate, animal, and ecological crises, and the mass killing which now characterises forms of life? And third, I mentioned earlier, the capacity we have both to critically analyse and to imagine alternative futures. And I think that capacity gives us particular prospective responsibility. Finally, confronting the stakes of the crisis, I think, demands that we really take risks in scholarship in the face of what is at stake. And I think this is what Bromberg was doing when we actually come face to face with what's at stake, trying out ideas that might not at first seem to work, might seem a bit clunky. I think there's a real obligation in the face of the scale of the crisis to be more experimental. And I'm thinking in particular of something that has come up a lot recently, of the question of the participation or representation of animals in democratic and other forms of decision-making. Often the argument is, but we don't know how to communicate with, or we don't know how to interpret other animals. And I just think that we can't now afford to take those type of practical impediments as a stop. We have to push forward even through the space of not knowing. So the expansive conceptions of responsibility that I've canvassed will no doubt provoke a number of serious objections and worries, like that they're impractical, that they don't provide sufficient guidance for dealing with very real conflicts that are likely to arise in enacting responsibility, or that they impose massive strains of commitment. And each of those, I think, really requires rigorous thought, and that's part of what we need to do, is think through these objections. And I think they're important ones. But the alternative isn't to, you know, so if people say something like, well, once we introduce all of these subjects of justice to whom its responsibility is owned, it's going to massively multiply the conflicts, and so we just can't do that. Well, the alternative is to, by default, decide that the interests of those who are going to complicate the matter are going to be discounted. And that's not just, that's just lazy. So I think we can't preemptively reduce complexity. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm going to end. But I just want to come back to say that I think we have to come back to that quote of Bromberg's that I started with, of the question of who is our neighbour, as climate crisis, ecological crisis, animal crisis, as Laurie Gruen and Alice Crary called it, intensifies. The neighbourhood relationship needs to press upon us ever more. They always were and are our neighbours in the most intimate way. Thank you.